Welcome everybody to our second South Asia Research Initiative event for 2021. Today, we're actually going to try something a little bit different. We'll be taking a slightly wider look than we normally do. Instead of looking at one country or a pair of countries as we have in the past, we'll be looking at a region or a sub-region as a whole. We'll be looking today at the Bay of Bengal. This is a sub-region that before the 20th century was extremely well connected by the movement of trade and people and ideas, but that transnational connectivity ground to a halt in the 20th century and hasn't really recovered yet. Even in our sort of mental maps, we think of South Asia and we think of Southeast Asia, and they're split right down the middle of the Bay of Bengal. That's the case for most government agencies, and it's even the case here at APARC. But there is, I think today, a growing appreciation that policymakers need to take a more holistic view of regions, and not least the Bay of Bengal certainly fits that bill. It is, of course, home to a very prominent and tragic cross-border refugee crisis that many people are familiar with, the Rohingyas of Burma, who are now encamped in Bangladesh. But it's also the home of transnational environmental threats, especially the massive Bengal Delta that spans India and Bangladesh is very vulnerable to climate emergencies. And transnational connectivity projects, on the other hand, that try and bridge these countries across borders, that India is quite strenuously trying to get off the ground now, belatedly. So to discuss these issues today, we've got a superb panel of experts. I'm super excited because we have finally a range of functional expertise so this event lets us sort of really bridge a bunch of different disciplines and fields of expertise. They all understand critically, though, the way that these policy challenges can cross borders. Again, you have their bios, so I won't rehash them, but by way of very brief introduction, we have Kelley Currie, who was most recently the US Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, has a long experience working in government and outside government on humanitarian issues, and has really good particular knowledge and networks in Burma. We have Tanaya Gupta, who is a Ph.D. candidate in sociology at UC Davis and has been doing great fieldwork on the effects of climate change on people in the Bengal Delta area. And Constantino Xavier is a senior fellow at the Center for Economic and Social Progress in Delhi, which is formerly Brookings, India, where he has launched a really terrific research initiative on connectivity in the Bay of Bengal, across South Asia, but including the Bay of Bengal region. We've got a ton to get through, so again, let me stop stealing oxygen and make a couple of quick housekeeping comments. Like our previous events, this will be a Q&A style event. I invite you out there in Zoom land to submit brief, please, questions through the Zoom Q&A function. Chat has been disabled. And so please bear with me because I will be ruthless in picking them and I'll bundle them together, and please keep them brief and relevant. So with that, let's begin. Let's begin with the headline event of the last couple of weeks, but let's take a slightly different look at it, which is the coup in Burma. And let's start talking about an issue that I think has been neglected in a lot of the commentary on the coup so far, which is what are the potential transnational effects or implications of the coup? So maybe I can start with you, Kelley, and ask you, how will this coup affect one of the biggest transnational issues that Burma is associated with in the region, which is the flow of people, including either the Rohingya or other people. I've heard recently that fighting has continued even after the coup between ethnic groups in the northern Shan state. Are they being displaced across borders? How does the coup affect the situation?
Well, thank you so much, Arzan. And it is great to be able to look at this from a slightly different, from the westward perspective, because so much of the conversation since the coup has been about China's reaction to it and ASEAN's reaction. But there has been a very important discussion about how this affects the plight of the Rohingya people who have fled to Bangladesh, as well as those who have remained in Rakhine State and who have and then the status of ongoing ethnic conflict around Burma's periphery, which does tend to lead to some of these mass migration events, whether they flow toward Thailand, China, or Bangladesh or India. So in the past, when there has been a coup or a crackdown of this nature, there have been substantial migrant outflows, and whenever there are upticks in fighting, which we have also seen in some areas, including, as you mentioned, in northern Shan State, additional and new clashes in Kachin State as well, and a kind of very tricky and situation in Rakhine State where the military appears to be trying to reach out to ethnic Rakhine leadership, has released a very prominent Rakhine politician who was in prison for stoking ethnic hatred and has engaged in an effort toward rapprochement with him. You've seen officials from the military going to the IDP camps in northern Rakhine State to talk about to go on weird listening tours to talk to the IDPs about what they need. And then you've also seen announcements that they expect to repatriate 100,000 Rohingya, return 100,000 people back to Burma. At the same time, you've seen in the camps solidarity with the anti-coup protesters, as well as a variety of responses across the ethnic armed groups in the north and northeast and west, ranging from announcements that ethnic armed organizations will protect protesters from the military and provide security for them, to more kind of middling statements of that look more wait and see, and kind of trying to see, give play both wings to the effort to reach out, and in some cases successful with these divide and rule tactics by the military to bring along some of these ethnic groups. So you could see a very, depending on the context, and there are a number of them, you can see very different scenarios playing out in each one. But I think that the likelihood that this is going to improve the situation for the Rohingya is very low. I think there are also potential issues that could spike with transnational crime if the military is subjected to additional sanctions that actually start to bite and have broader effect. Then that could lead them to a greater reliance on illicit activities such as drug trafficking and deforestation and wildlife trafficking, other forms of, and as well as create pressure for human trafficking and outmigration in that way. So I think that the signs at this point are not very good as long as the coup continues, and it's going to be increasing. It's going to be very interesting to see how the regional partners, India in particular, and Bangladesh respond, and whether they see opportunities here, and how they choose to play those opportunities in this very complicated environment.
That's a really good overview, and you've actually just triggered a couple of follow-on questions in my mind. Constantino, if I can bring you in just on a question that just occurred to me when Kelley mentioned India. How has the coup been seen in India, not in and of itself as an event that occurs in Burma? Of course, that's a big issue for India. But has India perceived in the coup any related transnational issues that could affect India more directly?
Thanks, Arzan, and thanks for having me. Really a good initiative, as you say, to look at this sub-region, you called it, but in some ways it's also a region in itself, this Bay of Bengal. It used to be one from so many lenses. So to your question, Arzan, I think the answer is the continuity. I think from the Indian side, the coup has been condemned in public and let's recognize that these have been quite strong words, unusual words the Indian government has used to describe what really has happened and appeal to a return to democratic normalcy. So those statements and that reaction has been clear and has led to some type of alignment with the US, to some type of diplomatic work behind the scenes that has been quite unusual, where India has been able to bridge the more, I'd say, stronger positions from the US and the Europeans with those on the other extreme, Chinese and Russian ones that tend to be hands off. So the United Nations Security Council statement reflects that work from India behind the scenes. But that is, of course, in terms of the concerns about democratic continuity, and not just out of a moral principle or any luxuries, because India really has invested over the last 10 years in strengthening Myanmar's democracy and the Burmese transition. But continuity in terms of engagement, I think the coup, if you look at the basic issues, transnational issues India worries about, now beyond the democratic angle, I'd say that there's continuity because India had already been working very closely with the Burmese army. In fact, relations had never been better, paradoxically, than under the last few years under a democratic setup in Burma. So the Burmese army leader and several other top leaders had visited India. And at the heart of that good relationship over the last 5 to 10 years has been the issue of insurgencies and security. So we tend to look, of course, at the domestic insurgencies in Burma as more focused on the border with China and Thailand towards the east and the south, but there are at least 3-4 active insurgencies towards the north on the border with India, including in the Chin province. So I think there's a lot of concern there always in India that to pacify its own border regions in the northeast region of India, in states, in particular in a state called Nagaland, that has a lot of militants crossing the border between India and Burma. There's a lot of concern in India in how any political development in Burma will play out for India on the security angle. And in that sense, the reaction has been positive or neutral because the Burmese military has cooperated tremendously over the last few years in helping the Indian army, including through joint exercise, coordinated exercises to stop the militancy. The second aspect that is more sort of substantive here beyond the security insurgency angle is the economic connectivity angle. A tremendous investment from the Indian side in recent years, since the 2000s, in fact, but particularly in the last few years, in developing the infrastructure, road infrastructure, multimodal trade, so border infrastructure, border control infrastructure along this 1,500 kilometers long border between India and Myanmar. And there again, the Myanmar army has, Tatmadaw has played ball with India, has cooperated, and has pushed for more connectivity between India, Myanmar, and therefore also between India and Southeast Asia and India and the Indo-Pacific at the largest really level.
Great, thank you, Constantino. I want to come back to the connectivity issue in a minute, but before we do, just to sort of close off on the Burma coup issue, Kelley, if I can ask you again, but this time going the other way, not Burma as we always think of it as a, unfortunately, as a source of transnational threats, but also as a destination for transnational investment, for example. Has the coup affected the flow of investment from any direction? I know there's been some talk of Chinese investment in the dam, for example, but what has been the effect of the coup on those transnational flows into Burma?
Well, so far, nothing at this point. I think that everybody is trying to assess the immediate fallout and what it means with the United States putting some limited sanctions to date in place, and then India and Japan did did make a statement, or did have some kind of statement that referred to the project that they've been involved in. And I think with the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, the Chinese are very, they're just very transactional about everything in Burma, and there does appear to be an effort by Min Aung Hlaing to try to reassure investors that their projects will proceed as before. So I think it's going to put the onus back on the companies and the countries involved to make those decisions about whether they want to work with the Coup and the junta as a partner. And there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure, I think, on a lot of countries not to do that and to slow roll things. And I think that you'll see that from the United States toward partners like India and Japan, for sure, to encourage them not to do things that could be perceived as providing legitimacy or resources to the junta. But as far as the Chinese, the potential for restarting the Myitsone Dam is a very tricky and interesting problem, because it's one of these things where the Chinese had this project has been stalled for 10 years now, and it was stalled under a previous government, under the Thein Sein government, and it was stalled for a number of reasons, but the NLD and the military have really not shown a lot of interest in reviving the project for a whole host of reasons. And the economic rationale for it has largely disappeared in the intervening time period since it was suspended. So it's a very strange thing that the military or that the Chinese continued to push the project, raise it in high-level meetings, and there was a bit of a puzzler as to why they were doing that, given the very strong resistance in Burma and the lack of economic viability. And there's now kind of a growing view that one of the reasons that they're doing this is because it's very much tied to the personal prestige of Xi Jinping, and is not really about any kind of economic or strategic imperative on the part of China, which makes it very interesting that Min Aung Hlaing has dangled it in front of him. And it'll be very interesting to see how the Chinese respond to that, if they take the bait.
Right. That, yeah, in fact, so much of what China is doing around the region seems to be tied up in not just the personal, but the current programmatic prestige of national rejuvenation. So I think a lot of it does get wrapped up in that as well. That's great. Now let me sort of zoom out a little and come back to the issue of connectivity, Constantino. You are, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to plug this yet, but you are writing, nearly finished, a book on India's approach to its neighbours, especially on this issue of the balance between values and sort of more pragmatic building of influence. And you did also mention in your earlier comment that India's response has been unusually or unexpectedly firm after this coup. So can you explain that trajectory? Why do you think this time around India's response, at least publicly, was more strident than it previously has been? And maybe in your answer, you can also talk about this issue of the balance being struck between values and sort of pragmatically trying to build influence and cooperation for national interests.
Yes, it's a work in progress, and it's kept me busy, and it's a really interesting dilemma, right? Values and interests, and India is a democracy. In fact, it's the largest democracy. It's never shied away from emphasizing its democratic credentials, its democratic experience. In fact, beyond the West, as a poor developing economy since the 1950s. So that shouldn't surprise us, and nor should it surprise us, I think, the difficulties in translating that into practice. I think the US has faced these difficulties, still faces them, whether it's in Saudi Arabia and many other countries and important strategic partners for the United States, and Pakistan also in the past. And I think for India, the dilemma is the same one. So everyone, I think it's to say all democracies have glass ceilings here, and they're all extremely vulnerable when it comes to trying to find a way to nudge, support, push, coerce, whatever you want, other countries to embracing a a path of political reform. And that's where the divergence then happens between the US and India, different cultures, different ways of looking at these issues, different geographies also. I mean, if you look at India's geography, and here we go again with Myanmar in these last few weeks, very difficult neighbors, right? Pakistan, China, Myanmar, Sri Lanka with its own civil war, Nepal went through absolutist monarchy and also civil war. So it's a luxury almost to be able to promote some type of a democratic foreign policy in this neighborhood. But on the more sort of technical forward way, Arzan, I think this is important because three things have happened that are bringing this up now. So the statement towards Myanmar from the Indian side is not new if you look at a series of other statements over the last 3 to 4 years, where India has emphasized the importance of democratic processes, constitutional processes, elections. And I'm thinking of the crises in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, for example, two other neighbors in recent years. In fact, those crises, if you look at the statements, they were also closely aligned with the American statements about concern of democratic rule in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, and not surprisingly, hiding a larger geostrategic concern shared by both India and the United States that a slide into authoritarianism is often seen as a propensity for these countries to get into a closer embrace with China, and that China is converting its economic leverage over these countries into greater security influence. We've seen that in terms of security and defense relations and their strategic choices of alignment, etc., but also into political influence at the basic institutional level, including at the basic level of micromanaging government formation, uh, uh, um, balance of power between different political parties, different factions. And I think that's what we're seeing now again in Myanmar. Maybe to a lesser extent, in fact, than we've seen in Nepal, for example, over the last year, where China was actively micromanaging a political crisis. In fact, Myanmar, in that sense, is a bit of an exception because the Chinese have been a bit cautious and I think have gone through this over the last 10 to 20 years and are a bit more skeptical now about getting involved too much. But it tells you about a growing alignment between India and a series of other actors, including Southeast Asian actors, by the way. If you look at the Southeast Asians coming out with much stronger concerns this time than 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when similar crises and moments have happened in Myanmar. So there's an emerging, I'd say, constellation of democratic, like-minded powers that want to engage for the reasons Ambassador Currie mentioned out, that this is also an important destination for investments where everyone is invested in engagement, but at the same time also concerned about the long-term governance stability and democratic transition as a required step for stability, for security in that country.
Yeah, thank you. But can you take it one step further? Like, take it one step back, I guess, in the causal chain. Why is there this increasing concern for stability and democracy? I mean, it sounds like it's a good thing, but what's driving it? Is it the C word, or is there something else to it aside from competition with China?
So it depends how you look at it, Arzan. I think some people will emphasize, I think, the necessary but not sufficient condition called China. I think China has just as a coming up with a different political model, naturally, I think, made many other countries realize that there are two basic systems of development in this part of the region and the world, by the way. This may be a bit more stark and coming up in recent years in the US under the President Trump, under the Trump administration, and under several European countries that were concerns about China, mostly for economic reasons, I think we have to recognize. But for the developing countries in Africa, in South Asia, and different parts of the world, this is really a difficult choice or difficult sort of comparison between two very different models of development. And beyond personal preferences or predictions, I think that's something we all recognize now, and that's something many developing countries recognize, and that's something that India recognizes. Coming to your question, I think India recognizes that democracy is not necessarily a burden. It can be a burden, and that's the dilemma, right? I think India sometimes looks at it as a burden in its foreign policy, that you have to come out with statements condemning, you have to be saying things that the Chinese can afford not to say, right? So it becomes really an irritant and an obstacle in the expedient foreign policy that you have to put up to do as much, if not more, than the Chinese are in your immediate neighborhood. So why bother with democracy? But on the other hand, and there coming to your question again, there is also a tendency, I think, in the last 10 to 20 years, is India just becomes more confident about its own democratic system and claims it as Indian, both in illiberal ways too, as we have seen. I mean, it cuts both ways, but it's certainly an Indian model now that is being claimed not longer as a colonial British model. And therefore, also a story of looking backwards. It's only been 70 years, right? But looking backwards, you actually recognize that democracy has also benefited you in terms of a path towards development, stability, territorial integrity, and diversity that may have some lessons for other countries that are also developing, diverse, non-Western, right? So I think beyond China, those are the reasons that are animating India's increasing recognition that it's in its own interest to support other countries in transition towards democracy with actual capacity building, not necessarily with statements and condemning and military interventions and sanctions, but if you look at the tremendous support India has been giving to Myanmar, electoral support, parliamentary support, civil military relations, training of the military at India's civilian institutions, where I'm sure they're trained in civil military separation of channels, right? So I think there's a whole history there of what India has done over the last 10 to 20 years in supporting quietly the democratic transition in Myanmar.
If I can just add just a little point there, because I saw this developing at the United Nations in particular, this contestation over models. That's a place where India is really, I think, has faced an existential challenge on this, because they're historically have taken this non-aligned G77 position very much to heart in their diplomacy and multilateral spaces. But over the past 4 or 5 years, we really saw them coming out of moving, separating themselves a little bit more from that and being more assertive, even within the G77, pushing back on Chinese efforts to instrumentalize the G77 for their own purposes. India became one of our best partners in terms of trying to help get things like Xi Jinping thought out of resolutions in the UN, and became much more active in that area. And when events happened in 2018 or 17 in Maldives, I remember it was India that came to the US and the UK and said, we need you to discuss this in the Security Council. And the Chinese and Russians were very unhappy about it, but the Indians were adamant that we needed it on the Security Council's agenda. And we were very happy to oblige them in that regard, and very happy, obviously, with the way things came out there. But I think that it was really important for the cooperation. I think India has learned some positive lessons that they can cooperate with the United States and other Western countries and improve their foreign policy outcomes, because they are in a serious contestation within their own region. And if you even, kind of flipping back to Burma, you look at just the town of Sittwe in Rakhine State, and there's a huge Chinese project that's right north of it. And then India also has a big port project in Sittwe. And, they both are really contesting in that space. And it's very clear there. It's very clear up on the China, India, Burma, the tri-junction there where their borders meet is another space that's heavily militarized. The insurgencies that come into India from Burma, some of them are actually based in Yunnan province, not in Burma, and are coming in, they're transiting through that tri-junction, but they're actually being given safe haven by Beijing. So there is a shared interest there along those lines, and it does create. It's not just as, you know, there's a lot of talk in the U.S. about great power competition, but with India, this is also their neighborhood and their backyard, and I think that often gets lost when people are looking at Burma and thinking about China as the major power player there.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and in fact, I think it also highlights just how complicated this is, because it's not just that democracy is a sort of complication to expediency, but in many ways, when engaged in this kind of competition, it actually reinforces expediency. It's actually a tool of statecraft, that it's a strength that democratic countries can pose a positive alternative to a different system of governance. So it's fascinating that democracy is both another factor that has to be considered, but it's also a strength that can be played to. Now let's change tack a little bit to go away from some of these more political, security-oriented issues and talk about some of the more emerging issues that I think countries like India are going to have to deal with from a transnational perspective. Tanaya, let me bring you in. You are the co-author or the lead author of a new paper from ORF, the Observer Research Foundation, on the interactive effects of the COVID-19 pandemic with natural disasters. Now, this really does seem like, reading the paper, it does seem like the sum of all fears, the perfect storm of horrible, what academics would call non-traditional security threats, all piling on each other and creating an interactive effect on people. Can I ask you first, for those who haven't read it, and they should, and maybe we can put this a link to this paper in the description, but can you give us a quick précis of the key findings of this paper?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Arzan, for inviting me to be a part of this exciting conversation. The beginning of COVID-19 lockdown measures in India, as we know, made visible the plights of millions of migrant workers stranded in urban centers across India without food, shelter, and livelihood support. And many of them began walking hundreds of miles back to their villages. A part of my research focuses on a group of migrant workers who returned to the villages in the Indian part of Sundarban in the state of West Bengal. And they were confronted by the cascading consequences of the pandemic, along with the disastrous effects of Cyclone Amphan that wreaked havoc in this region. And Cyclone Amphan was reported to be one of the strongest cyclones to develop over Bay of Bengal, and it made landfall over the coastal region of eastern India as well as the coastal region of Bangladesh. My key finding in this paper indicates that the intersecting impacts of the pandemic-induced lockdown and Cyclone Amphan have made prominent a peculiar juxtaposition of mobility and immobility in the lives of these returned migrants. Because in a non-COVID world, spatial mobility would have been an expected strategic response to Cyclone Amphan, which is similar to what happened after Cyclone Aila in 2009, when storm surges and saline water intrusion inundated agricultural lands and made them unsuitable for cultivation for multiple seasons. And so people moved out of the region in search of alternative livelihoods. But now, the coincidence of Cyclone Amphan with the pandemic has created a situation where immobility was expected and even enforced as the norm. And that has shaped their experiences of being stuck in a medium-term limbo without the ability to plan for an immediate future. And that has culminated in an ongoing livelihood crisis in the Sundarban region. And The paper, my co-authors and I, we also make the argument that policymaking for such a population who are affected by this converging of crises must aim beyond the shorter term relief and compensation model to focus on more medium and longer term livelihood recovery through more robust social protection mechanisms as a pathway to achieve economic self-reliance and build resilience.
That's great. We will explore more the government responses to it and policy responses to these types of threats. But before we do that, Kelley, can I ask you? I'm not sure if you've read this paper or not, but regardless, based on what Tanaya just said, have you heard of or come across any sort of pandemic effects on the multiple human crises in Burma? As an overlay on top of all the insurgencies and the ethnic fighting that may cross borders, has there been a notable effect of the pandemic on any of this?
So I think much like India, Burma has weathered it relatively well. There was, despite having an incredibly weak public health system and a lot of conditions that should have led them to have for COVID to be an absolute disaster, including conflict and other things. I think that they have actually, the situation has not been as dire as many predicted, but there's been criticism of the government's response earlier in the pandemic, but it didn't affect the NLD's electoral performance in November, and they were able to hold elections at a pretty high level. Although that was one of the issues that the military regime has, of course, raised as precipitating the coup, that the denial of franchise in the November 2020 elections, which was mostly due to security reasons, but they've also latched onto that. I think that one of the things that has been a surprise is because they were under lockdown right before the coup took place, there were curfews and security and COVID-related lockdowns. And one of the crimes that NLD leadership has actually been accused of is violating restrictions violating COVID restrictions by meeting with people during a lockdown period. And so that there have been some kind of quirky political aspects to it, but there was a question as to whether people would go out in the streets because of the COVID lockdown restrictions, and clearly they have. Clearly they have not really been too concerned. I don't know if this is a youth issue where we saw in the United States where young people were very willing to go out in the streets even during the pandemic, and I think there's been pretty good evidence at this point that there's not a lot of outdoor transmission of COVID, that's not like a real, that's not a huge part of what creates the vectors for spread. So it does seem that people are not, while it's there and it's an ever-present threat, it's now become almost the butt of a joke where people, you've seen protesters holding up signs that, you have COVID, we've got, and they put up a picture of men online. And and then say this is worse, and so they're they use it as almost a point of humor. So I think that would be the main aspect right now at this point.
Right. Yeah. Well, certainly some countries have escaped the scourge better than others, but it has created a pretty, as Tanaya's research shows, a pretty dire systemic problem, certainly in parts of India. And in fact, your research, Tanaya, talks about how the pandemic, especially when combined with the natural disaster of the cyclone, ground to a halt the normal cycle of mobility of internal migration. And that cycle of mobility, that cycle of internal migration happened because, as you said, concluding your remarks, that there is a dearth of local economic opportunity where these migrant workers leave from, and that is one of the key policy challenges, is to increase economic opportunity in those areas. So let me now connect a couple of these threads and ask Tino, when we think of transnational connectivity projects that India is championing and supporting in conjunction with others, what is the prospect for these transnational connectivity projects to also provide economic opportunity to local populations, such as those that Tanaya has been researching in the Sundarbans? Like, is there a mechanism by which these connectivity projects also help locals within northeastern India?
I think it's almost the inverse. I think it's the economic growth of India and the reforms the country has embraced quite late compared even to Myanmar, by the way. I mean, Myanmar paradoxically opens up its economy earlier and faster than the Indian one, which only starts in 1990. It's in the 80s that Myanmar starts experimenting with economic reforms with Chinese help already at that point. So India's a latecomer, but post-90s, certainly we've seen the story develop of how there is just growing demand now in the market economy in India for imports. And naturally, I think that is driving India's interest in connecting more with its neighbors. And to connect with your immediate neighbors, you really have to develop your basic infrastructure and your borderlands infrastructure. In fact, the physical infrastructure that had laid stagnant, if not in ruins, over decades, precisely because India embraced back in the 1960s a model of autarky, import substitution, protectionism, and isolation from the rest of the capitalist world, if you want, right? So the transition since the 1990s has led to growth and has led then therefore to a realization that you need to be more integrated with your neighbor markets, and therefore develop. We're talking about the most basic infrastructure, Arzan. I mean, you must have heard me sometimes note this to some exhaustion, but it's just so important to emphasize that if you look at India's neighbor regions, and let's forget now the ports of India and the whole story within the mainland of the subcontinent of India, but if you go to the northeast region where these semi-enclaved Indian states are between China, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, right? That region, the infrastructure has been abysmal, and in fact has led then to security problems and to a series of insurgencies. And I think Kelley's mentioned a variety of flows. I think Tanaya also studied this, right? Whether it's the refugees and more or less transnational flows that have only further destabilized that region. And I think what has changed now is that if you look at the northeast region of India that borders Myanmar, two developments have been central. One is the reduction in levels of violence. So if you look at any indicator of violence in the northeast region, it has come down over the last 10 to 20 years progressively. So reduction in number of active insurgencies, reduction also in illicit smuggling, human trafficking, drugs, of course, were a huge issue between Myanmar and India. But certainly in terms of political violence, the numbers have come down. And on the other hand, the economic growth of the region has picked up. So if you look again at the indices of development in the northeast of region, they've done actually much better than the rest of India in relative terms, right? So they've really caught up with the rest of the country. So I think behind connectivity is the story of growth. And that, of course, then pushes India to gravitate east towards the Bay of Bengal, as we've discussed, that region that is a mirror of this disconnectivity of decades and that is being integrated slowly now, and particularly towards the Southeast Asia, right? So if you look at India's Act East policy and India's efforts towards the East, they're mostly focused not so much on connecting with China. In fact, India's been very reluctant about developing infrastructure connectivity between its Northeast region and China. This was something that had been discussed in the 90s and 2000s, has been put on the back burner now, especially as the Belt and Road Initiative has become just such a massive and concerning development. But towards Southeast Asia, there's very interesting developments. And for that, you require connectivity between the Northeast and Myanmar on the physical front. So there's been tremendous developments on inland waterways as channels for commerce, transit between India and the Northeast region via Bangladesh, something we couldn't even have dreamt of 15 to 20 years ago, but is happening now. Projects on the border in terms of new customs, immigration checkposts on India and Myanmar have been opened in the last few years. The old trilateral highway with ups and downs to connect India to Thailand has also seen some progress. I think Kelley had mentioned Sitwe, and of course, India's projects there in the port, and also in the Kaladan sort of multimodal project that seeks to connect India's eastern coast with Myanmar, if you want some type of a response to the China-Myanmar economic corridor from the western side. But I think, yes, so therefore the connectivity angle is, I would say, the most fascinating angle because it's about infrastructure, it's about flows, and it relates to the issue also of a long-term security of the population, right? You cannot pull these projects off if you do not have satisfied these populations and brought some type of security and stability to a variety of groups in this region. And the Rohingya issue comes up, the Nagas and several other Indian populations. There's a whole sense of unrest over decades, centuries even in this region, that needs to be pacified if you really want to have an integrated, modern, developed economy in these regions.
Yeah, that's superb. That's I mean, from that perspective, it seems like something that is so tremendously long overdue and so full of benefits. But let me bring it back to the topic of Tanaya's research, the sort of the attempt to build longer-term economic opportunity and prosperity to provide a systemic solution to these problems. Can you expound a little bit on what the government response has been along those lines, and or what it should be? Your paper has some recommendations. And to connect it to what Tino was saying, where does transnational connectivity fit into that? How important, from the perspective of building local economic opportunity, how important is transnational connectivity?
Thank you for that question, Arzan. So when we are thinking of government response, we need to first think that the countrywide COVID lockdown was the foremost government response to COVID that exacerbated or made more visible the precariousness of migrant workers who had to return to one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world, the Sundarban. And in the 2020 monsoon session of the Parliament, the Ministry of Labour and Employment revealed that more than 10 million migrant workers were estimated to have returned to their home states during the lockdown, but they could not provide details about the exact number of migrant workers registered under the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act of 1979, because apart from a few states, that act has not been implemented in most of the states. And so there is definitely a dearth of data regarding the migrants, the exact details of their returning. And so that's one of the recommendations of the paper, is to maintain a data bank with the caveat that there are confidentiality issues that need to be the confidentiality concerns that need to be addressed, as well as it also recommends having a data bank for the migrants, where not just a data bank of the migrants, so where information can be shared about potential employment opportunities, so that they can be re-embedded in social networks, because during COVID and its intersecting effects with Amphan, these migrant workers, got disconnected from the social networks that they had initially followed in search of work in the other states. And in terms of the state government response, though relief and compensation efforts have been mobilized immediately following the devastation caused by Cyclone Amphan, the participants in the study have shared that these efforts have not been adequate or effective because of the unequal distribution of relief. And even the NGOs and civil society organizations, and a large number of them, took up the initiative to help the people in the Sundarban. These NGOs also need to work through the local government, the Gram Panchayats. And so the local politics definitely plays a role here. And but to think of the response of the government overall, I would also like to include this point that India is a signatory to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Sendai Framework of Disaster Risk Reduction. It has framed policies like the National Action Plan for Climate Change and then state action plans for climate change, which for West Bengal includes Sundarban as one of the key regions. But the disaster management efforts do not go much beyond disaster relief. And so there needs to be focus on recovery. And the question of providing economic opportunities, like how do we think about economic recovery? Our paper makes a few recommendations, and one of that is establishing a resilience fund through which there can be a credit system, a formalized credit system, so that migrants do not have to go to informal money lenders who are often predatory and accumulate more debt that way. So the formalized credit system can work in a way where in times of crisis situations like this, there can be loan waivers and other kinds of mechanisms that would protect them from shocks like this, especially in cases where they are unable to move out in search of work, especially in situations like this where they find themselves just trapped in place. And apart from this, on a longer term, access to socioeconomic resources can be provided in a way that migrants can decide for themselves where and when to relocate, instead of seeing relocation or migration from this region as a last resort, as an inevitability.
Right. Now, but so let me ask you to sort of extend that answer a little bit. The Sundarbans obviously extend beyond borders, both India and Bangladesh, and you've done fieldwork in both countries. What is either the reality or the scope or potential for cooperation between either the central government of India and Bangladesh, or even lower levels of government like states, to cooperate on some of these issues? Is there any benefit to be had from transnational cooperation, to, especially over the longer term, to ensure that the people who inhabit this region have, over the longer term, better prospects?
Okay, so when we think of transboundary cooperation, and I'm sorry I did not address that part of the question in your earlier question. When we think of transboundary cooperation, India and Bangladesh, they have already signed an MOU for the conservation of Sundarban and a protocol for the conservation of the Royal Bengal tigers. But if we look at the critical analysis of this policy and the cooperation initiative, it has also been critiqued in the sense that these policy collaboration efforts do not really go beyond conservation efforts. So efforts of conservation of biodiversity, and somehow the communities that inhabit this region, and they share so much. They have shared histories, shared language, social ties, cultural ties, and they also share how they're impacted by climate change and recently COVID. These communities are often overlooked and alienated when it comes to policy responses. But there can be lessons from both sides of the border, and there can be efforts to, there is potential for policymaking efforts to collaborate on issues of livelihood security, and so that the Delta lives and livelihoods can be, they can have better opportunities to either decide whether to migrate or to adapt in situ. And I would like to focus here on a couple of examples. So in the Bangladesh part, studies have compared this disaster management frameworks in Bangladesh and India, and they have found that compared to Bangladesh, India's disaster management framework is more centralized and vertically integrated, whereas Bangladesh, there are more volunteer-based efforts, more door-to-door communications that makes the early warning systems of cyclones more effective. And so the example I want to focus on here is called the Gucciogram Climate Victims Rehabilitation Project, which began in 2009, and it was a 3-year project that tried to rehabilitate almost 9,000 families in 198 villages. And so instead of the migrants going to cities and ending up in unplanned slums, there are examples like this that can be used as a model for both sides of the border. For India's part, however, there are examples of government-initiated formal resettlements, especially from the Ghoramara Islands and the Lohachara Islands. So the latter, Lohachara Islands, disappeared somewhere in the 1990s due to erosion, and Ghoramara has reduced in size by 70%. And so the displaced households from those islands have been rehabilitated, resettled in the Sagar Island. But the entitlements have reduced over time because of the scarcity of public land availability. And in other places facing similar situations, formal resettlement efforts have been absent. And so this also ties in with the idea that how can sharing of these experiences and lessons from these experiences can lead the way to transboundary cooperation that goes beyond just biodiversity conservation in the Sundarban.
Right. No, that's excellent. That's a really good example of the type of case study that could be used and applied. I'm conscious that we are right up against the end time. So I have just, if you will bear with me, guys, 2 final questions. And let me pose them in the interest of time, one to Constantino and one to Kelley. Tino, we've got a couple of questions come in on the Q&A, and I want to bundle them for you. And this concerns something we haven't spoken about today, the maritime domain. I mean, the Bay of Bengal is a body of water. So let me ask you, sort of combining these 2 questions into one, what do you see as the prospect for maritime connectivity and trade between India and, say, Southeast Asia, or let's say across the Bay of Bengal, whatever, however you want to scope it? And the flip side of that, the corollary of that is, what are the prospects for maritime disputes? between India and neighboring countries, and not just in the northern Bay of Bengal, but also, say, with Sri Lanka. Have you got any views on this?
I think on the first one is there's a tremendous progress happening in terms of the basic infrastructure, including on the maritime side. We spoke a lot on the land dimension in the northeast and the continental side of things. But if you look at a project under the Asia Development Bank, for example, SASEC, South Asia Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation Program, it's a bunch of countries that are literally, I mean, it's from Myanmar to India, and it's basically developing within India a belt of multimodal connectivity on the eastern coast of India to allow unhindered flow of trade between India's hinterland states and Southeast Asian economies, which are seen as the major, most immediate export market for India. So not surprisingly, the Singaporeans have also been interested in this and investing in this. But the SASEC program, for example, under the ADB, for me, is an example of how you can also bridge that divide, right? You spoke about the Bay of Bengal somehow being split between South and Southeast Asia. So that's ASEAN and SAARC, for example. That is a bridge, that is a division which happens in an area you work a lot on, Arzan, in the military sphere, right? Sort of you have sometimes still, of course, the Indo-Pacific Command up to the eastern coast, but then on the other side of India, you have the Central Command. But across the Bay of Bengal, I think even State Department in the US, you have still the old South Asia, and then you have the Southeast Asia, and exactly that bridge between India and Myanmar. So I think there's a lot of good things happening there. I mentioned ADB, but you can also think of the BIMSTEC organization, for example, which is a regional organization of 7 countries in this area that is being revived slowly but steadily, precisely because of this realization that you need to have greater maritime connectivity, greater blue economy investment in that Bay of Bengal region to allow this to be sort of an economic bridge space between South and Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific, in fact, at a wider point. In fact, I'm reminded of, I think, former Secretary Clinton's speech, I think in Chennai, sometime in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. She'd come at some point to visit to Chennai, India, and we speak about the Indo-Pacific, but at that point, she was already highlighting the importance of connecting the eastern coast of India to Southeast Asia. That's always been on the agenda of India since the 90s, of the US since the 2000s, etc. On the security aspect, yes, I think that's been really the heart of this great discussion today. There's a tension between the economic connectivity agenda and the security agenda. There will be disputes. We see it, I think the question mentioned fisheries between India and Sri Lanka. We see it again in terms of the also fisheries between India and Myanmar, a lot of tensions happening vice versa. You see it in the India-Bangladesh maritime boundary dispute that was peacefully solved at the arbitration level a few years ago. But there's still other maritime boundary issues that are still to be decided in this Bay of Bengal region. So I think there's a variety of disputes that could flare up. And again, the Rohingya issues and the flows of refugees from and across borders is going to become an issue that needs to be solved and needs a transnational approach towards governance solutions. And that's where India, together with the United States and many other countries, Japan was mentioned here, play a very important role in offering some type of solutions and capacity also to equip these states in the region to have their own conflict resolution methods and their own governance models and institutional resilience to deal with these challenges. Cyclones, environmental disasters. In fact, one last institution I want to call out to Arzan is the ICIMOD in Kathmandu. It's the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. A long name, but it's in Kathmandu, and they've done excellent work on climate change, resilience, mitigation in the Himalayan region, but with tremendous effects on the Bay of Bengal and connecting that maritime oceanic angle to the mountains and that larger ecosystem in this region.
Excellent. No, that's a really good survey, and it's brought up a number of things that I want to tie together in my last question, which is to Kelley. Kelley, you had the first and now the last question of the day, which is, we've been talking about transnational challenges, right? So what is the role? Tino mentioned a few of them, BIMSTEC, ASEAN, SAARC, and the mountain one in Kathmandu. What is the role of international institutions in managing some of these transnational issues? I'm thinking of, in particular, sort of conflict resolution conflict resolution for conflicts that go across boundaries, but also, transnational displacement or climate change or whatever. From your experience at the UN and in and out of government, to what extent do you think the best approach to tackling these issues is an ad hoc collection of countries sitting down to deal with them, or established institutions with secretariats with their own resources to sit down and deal with these issues?
Well, I'm going to always say it depends. And so that's always, I'm going to say that again here. I think that, one of the things that I saw, and I think we're seeing now with India as an elected member of the Security Council, is the desire of India to play a role in these big organizations and to compete with China in these big organizations and shaping them and doing that. There's a benefit to the United States and to other democracies to coordinate and collaborate with India to support them in that effort. At the same time, some of these institutions have proven to be incredibly ineffective in dealing with these transboundary issues. And in particular, as long as China remains a veto-wielding member of the Security Council, they're going to be able to block any activities in the Security Council that they see as threatening their interests, which they define in this region in a very particular way that often is contrary to not only India, but to the other countries as well, and to the goals of international peace and security. So I could see, when I think about what's happened the past few years in particular, and how quick China was to jump into the middle of the space between Bangladesh and Burma on the Rohingya issue and set up these trilateral discussions, and then try to block not only the Security Council, but others out from those discussions and try to take over, not actually to do anything, and certainly not to resolve the problem in any meaningful way, but just as a means of keeping it out of other people's keeping others out of the space. It was really a very kind of selfish blocking move that they pulled there. And I think that there is when this kind of thing happens, and I see this whether it's with the coup, where the United States, Japan, India, Singapore, some of the better organized regional players could get together and come up with better solutions that actually are more in the spirit of solving problems in the global commons, and create ad hoc organizations that actually are more results oriented and are focused on solving discrete problems, where the UN becomes very paralyzed and ineffective. I think those are that may be the wave of the future, given how many of these organizations have become hopelessly inept and sclerotic in trying to deal with certain issues. But creating more specific and focused forum for being able to address these issues is one way out of that dead end. The other thing that I think is really important when we think about connectivity, and I think back almost 20 years when Japan started talking about connecting their Chennai facilities to their facilities in Thailand, and how that connectivity was a huge project for them, and the tremendous economic benefits that they would see, that their own industries would see, as well as the communities in those countries would see, and what that has meant for connectivity, and thinking that way. I mean, it can't just be about connectivity for the sake of connectivity. It's also got to be economically viable, and that's where I think that you will see, we can work with partners that are doing things less for geopolitical or vanity reasons, but more about how are we solving problems? How are we creating economies of scale that benefit communities, that create economic opportunities for these communities in ways that help them on their own journey to self-reliance, to borrow the phrase of the USAID here, that has refocused our own assistance on how we help countries to really strengthen their own resilience. And we're talking about countries that really have incredible potential, but do lack connectivity, do have issues with resilience, and are subject to these transborder and transnational challenges that require them to work together, but don't have the habits of doing that. So anything that we, as the United States, as an outside party, can do to help foster those habits of collaboration, we should be doing. And we've got to think about, but there's got to be an outcome at the end. There's got to be a payout at the end in some way, whether it's a peace and security payout or a political development payout internally, or an economic payout, or all three, because the prosperity of the region depends on them all finding better ways to collaborate and work together. And ultimately that is in obviously the interests of the individual countries, as well as countries that are concerned about, when the U.S. thinks about great power competition in the Indo-Pacific, it's about how we protect the commons, how we secure a free and open Indo-Pacific. It's about, open infrastructure and architecture. That is not the model that the Chinese are putting forward. And so when we think about the contestation and models that are contesting, that's the other aspect of it that is really, really important for our partners, for India and Japan and others who are investing in connectivity in this region, to really be very, very mindful of, is like creating open architecture and not, the kind of schemes that the Chinese have been proposing.
Yeah. See, you started off by saying it depends, but your answer was pretty clear, clearly on one side at the end. Thank you all so much. I've got a couple of really sort of big takeaways from this. We normally, studying international relations, when the word transnational is used, it's usually a qualifier or a description of threats, right? It's usually transnational threats. But clearly, I think what you've just been talking about, Kelley, and what we've all been talking about, whether it's building economic resilience or multimodal connectivity, what we're talking about is transnational opportunities as well, especially because the Bay of Bengal, when we look at a bigger map, not just South Asia or Southeast Asia, but when we look at a bigger map, the Bay of Bengal really is at the center of the Indo-Pacific. And so as we've, all three of you have brought up the important role that is played, not just by the countries on the Bay of Bengal, but also countries across the Indo-Pacific who have a real stake in what happens here, whether it is resilience, economic opportunity, or connectivity for a useful, tangible outcome. So I think at least I'm left with a redoubled appreciation for how important the Bay of Bengal is. I hope you out there in Zoom land are as well. Thank you all for speaking and sharing your insights, and we'll see you next time.